Hi, welcome back to Learn Payload with Colin. Today we're continuing our series on user authentication and moving right along into OAuth login with GitHub. In our previous video, we talked about passwordless login, where we enabled the user to submit their email address and we would send them a link, which includes a token that when they click on it will automatically log them in, kind of a one-time password kind of deal. And the work we did in that previous video allowed us to move fairly quickly on the GitHub login because we need some functionality that will allow us to log in a user without a password. And so that's what we built in the previous video, and we're going to be using that function to help us along in logging them when they're coming back from GitHub and creating that user as well. So let's dive right into it. If you're new here, I am Colin Brown. I've been a web developer for 20 years, and I'm learning Payload CMS for the first time within the last month or two, and I'm going to be using it for a lot. I'm going to be integrating it quite a bit into my consulting, but I decided to document my education on Payload CMS on this channel. And my first series is called My First 100 Videos. We're on lesson number 17. And again, moving right along into user authentication. And so I appreciate those of you who have been following along. But if you're new here, definitely subscribe to get notified of upcoming videos. I try to keep these limited to 10 to 15 minutes. And I try to publish one at least once a day. Let's dive right into the code. First, we're going to do a demo of a review of the passwordless login, and then we'll move right into a demo of GitHub, and then we'll dive into the code. All right, let's do it. Okay, we're on the login page where you can either send a login link, have a login link be sent to you, or log in with GitHub. I'm going to do a quick review on the passwordless login link, and then we'll move into the GitHub. So that sent the link to hello@example.com. I'm using a fake inbox by a service called mailtrap.io. I talk about it a little more in the previous video, but I'll have to do a separate video on setting up email adapters, as well as being able to templatize the content of your emails in a nice way within React. I can go into more detail, but it's all in my repo as well, so you're welcome to dig into that. I'll have a link to the repo in the description, of course. And so here's the email for passwordless login, and then you just click the link, and that'll redirect you back over to the admin panel logged in. So easy enough. So again, in that previous video, you'll learn all about how I did that. The benefit of that previous video was that it allowed us to really understand the internals of Payload to properly set the auth cookie so that Payload will authorize access to the admin panel and make sure you're an authorized user. That cookie has to be set up just right, and so that really that passwordless login feature helped us learn that quite a bit. And we're going to use that for this GitHub login as well. So I just clicked on the GitHub button, log in as GitHub, and then that takes me over to my GitHub account. And then you just authorize, and just like the login link in the email, this redirects you back to the admin panel logged in. And so that's simple concept, but we'll go through the code real quick to show you how it works. So here on my login form, I have this GitHub button, and when you click it, it activates this server action here. GitHub authorize. And its job is really all it's doing is redirecting you back over to github.com to this path, login, OAuth, authorization path. All you have to do is you pass in client ID, and then you pass in your GitHub app client ID. We'll go over that too. And then just to be sure, I think this is the default scope, but it does let you manage what kind of information do you want to get out of this authorization. And I just said scope equals read access to the user. And that's all it does. That's all that button will do, is it just redirects you over to GitHub, and then it asks you to authorize the app to log in on your behalf. And then what it does is it redirects you back over to your app using a callback URL that you can define within your GitHub app, but also you'll create that endpoint, the custom endpoint, which I'm about to show you. So you click the authorization in your GitHub app, and then GitHub redirects you back over to this endpoint. If you go into GitHub, you'll notice, where is it? Right here. There's an authorization callback URL in the GitHub app. And this just takes you back to /API/auth/GitHub/callback. You can set this up however you want. It probably needs to be prefixed with /API, because we're going to be doing this with a custom endpoint in Payload. Payload allows you to add your own API endpoints, so using their configuration. And so that's fairly straightforward. I have a config folder here, and I have endpoints. So I have all my blocks, my collections, fields, globals, all of that, including my custom endpoints. And in the previous video, talking about passwordless login, I have some server actions, or some endpoints for that as well. So like the verify login token, I created a custom endpoint, and when you're using these custom endpoints for within Payload, imagine all of these are prefixed with /API, all these paths that you set. And so, yeah, I have a custom endpoint file for authentication related endpoints. And so, yeah, password login, this is the one where I verify the token and log the user in. And then likewise, I have one for the GitHub URL callback. And you can, again, set this up, create the path in any way you see fit. I said auth, GitHub, callback. And again, this is technically prefixed with /API. It is a GET request. And then the handler. So GitHub will, when it redirects you back to the app, it adds a query string parameter to the URL called, the query string param is just code. The name of the param is code. And so I grab that. And then the way to authorize, to get the information about that user, you take this code and you make a post request over to github.com access token, and you pass along the client ID and the client secret from the app that you create, and we'll go over that, as well as the code. And the response to that is either going to be an error, of course, and then in this case I redirect back over to the login page and then manage the error that way. But else I grab the response body, await the JSON, And then in that response body, I get an access token. That if something's wrong with the access token, again, I redirect back over to the login page with an error and manage the error that way. Once you have the access token, you can then do another fetch over to, it could be a GET request over to GitHub, grabbing the user details. And you just use a bearer token for that, getting the access token, using the access token. Grab the GitHub user out of the body of the response. And then here I'm just checking to make sure it exists. And also, this is important, also check to make sure that there's an email. In my case, I didn't even realize this, but I didn't even have an email set in my GitHub account before testing this out. For a long time, I couldn't figure out why I wasn't able to log a user in. Turns out my profile didn't have an email address set to it. There's a login email, of course, but for some reason it wasn't exposed in the profile. I'm not exactly sure. And I don't know if that's a default, so just make sure you check that out. And so if there's not an email or a user, I redirect back over to the login page with an error and handle the error that way. From there, I take the email address and name, and I created a function called getUserByEmail. And similarly to the passwordless login lesson that we did previously, I set it up so that if the email is not found, if the user is not found by this email address, we go ahead and just create the user. And we'll dive right into that. So I have this, let's see. So just kind of doing a review from the previous video. So I have getUserByEmail. I pass in the data, which in this case was passing in the email address and the name. So we have email. So first I try to find the user by email address, and then if there's not a user, total docs equals 0, I await and create the user and pass in the data. So the same data, the email address and the name. If there is a user, I just return the user. You can see there, I just grab the user, the first doc, element 0, item 0 in the array of docs. And then so creating a user is fairly straightforward. I generate a password, first of all, from here, and using create ID. Create ID is just a way of, I'm using this library called Parallel Drive CUID2. You could use whatever you want, anything that generates random strings. I could also use random bytes. I'll probably clean this up, but yeah, random bytes is what I used for that token for the passwordless login. It's a native Node library. So 6 of one, half dozen the other. You could use one or the other, whatever. So so here's the password. I'm creating the user with the name that I just passed in, and then I default it to guest if there was no name, and then email address, and then password. I don't think you can create a user without a password. I haven't tried that. Maybe you can. Maybe you can. I'm not sure. Doesn't matter. So they're never going to know this password anyway, and that if they need to log in with a password, they can just request a new password. So, but we're not doing that today. So, so yeah, the user gets created. We send that back over to this getUserByEmail. We return it. We return that user, and then we head over here. Now we have that user, either a found user or one we just created using this name and email. And then just like the previous video, we created a function called login with, where you can just pass in the user and it logs you in. It creates the cookie with the requirements that Payload expects to ensure that when you log in, Payload recognizes you as a valid user. And the cool thing about a function like this is it could be used anywhere. You can, anywhere you want to, for whatever reason you want to log a user in and you don't have their password, anywhere in your app, you can say, hey, I have this user, I want to be able to log them in. And this might be useful for like an admin panel where you have a list of users and you can, under each user, there could be a link that says log in as, or act as, or whatever language you want to use around that. I'm sure you're familiar with where an admin user can go in and log in as another user, which is they can log in as another user so that they don't have to ask them for their password, usually in a kind of a customer service role, or maybe your user is having some issues and you're not really able to reproduce it. And so you're like, well, maybe you could reproduce it by logging in as them. And so a function like this goes a long way to have all kinds of features like that. That's the only reason why I'm bringing that up. And so there is, that function is inside here, login with. And I go into this function in more detail in the previous video, but we'll do a quick review. Basically, I grab the user and I add this property to the user object called collection. So the cookie does the JWT payload, not to be confused with Payload CMS, the payload of the JWT requires this key, this collection, and so users. And so I just created a variable called user with collection. And there's some error handling. I grab the secret, and then I have this object. These are the fields. This is the object that's going to be ultimately the payload, so to speak, that we're going to sign as a JWT. And we have this function called JWT sign. Again, I go into way more detail on this kind of stuff in the previous video. I don't have a lot of time to go through it again, but basically this works in the same way that Payload expects and returns the JWT using whatever fields you have available that you want to include in the JWT. By default, it's just the email address and ID as well as the collection name. But you may have it configured so that you have a role in there, for instance. And so I didn't want to hard code any of that in here. And so I have a lot of these functions that allows me to not have to hard code things like the role. If I were to configure Payload to include role in my JWT, I wouldn't have to update any of this code because this stuff already recognizes any of those custom configurations. So yeah, the less hard coding of this stuff, the better, because over time, lots of things may change. And so you don't want to have to keep updating your code every time you change your configuration or Payload changes something in their source code. And so we try to map a lot of this stuff to code that already exists and that kind of stuff. So we set the cookie in the way that Payload expects, and then from there we go back to that endpoint. So we have the GitHub user, get the user, we log in with, and of course if there's any error there, we redirect back over to the login page. But other than that, once the cookie is set, we redirect back over to the admin panel and you're logged in. So that's the whole thing. Let's quickly go over setting up a GitHub application. So let's do that. So once you're logged into GitHub, go over to your profile settings. So you just click on your name and your avatar, go over into settings, and then you'd go into developer settings here at the bottom left in the left nav. So user settings, then developer settings, and then OAuth apps is what you want. This was a little confusing to me. Like, what's the difference between a GitHub app and an OAuth app? I wasn't quite sure. So this OAuth apps is where you want to go. So go in there. I'm just demoing some stuff here, but this is the one we created for this lesson called Learn Payload. But let's just create a new one. Callback URL. And so here's where you put the callback URL. Again, you can set this up in any way you want. But the one we created in Payload as with the custom endpoint was API. Go back over to this endpoint. We have auth, so we'll just copy this. Make sure you remove any double slashes. And I think that should be it. Once that's created, you have your client ID. Let's copy that. That goes in your environment variables. So make sure you have GitHub client ID and GitHub client secret. We're going to replace this, and obviously these are going to be blown away by the time you've seen this video. So so make sure you have client ID in there, and then you generate a secret. There's our secret. Copy that. Save that. And you can see payload reloaded the .env file. So let's see if that worked. And you can see, yes, it recognized the new app that I just created called Learn Payload Demo. And now we authorize. And now we're logged in. So everything worked. That was very quick to set up an app. But it's quick to set up an app, but sometimes it's hard to find like where you're supposed to do it, honestly. It was a little confusing. There's a lot of stuff in GitHub. But yeah, that's it. I hope you found this valuable. Very quick, a very quick one, hopefully. And yeah, in the next one, I think I'm going to go over into more detail around the UI stuff that I've done, especially like customizing emails and the setting up the email provider and that kind of stuff. So, all right. Thank you so much for hanging out today, and we'll see you in the next one.